You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hi there, it's Leo Laporte. Every week on our Tech News Roundtable, This Week in Tech, I bring together some of the smartest journalists and tech experts to make sense of the stories that actually matter to you. We cut through the noise, have real conversations, and give you a clear look at the trends shaping the future. It's smart, it's fun, it's a show I love doing the most. You can download and subscribe at twit.tv/twit.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 245, Yugoslavia Part 1, Belgrade's Impossible Position. This week, a big thank you goes out to Brad, Kevin, Andrew, Mac, and Douglas for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. Also, thanks to everybody who sent really encouraging messages about the Q&A episode that was released last week here on the podcast feed. Remember, if you have questions that you want me to answer, it's historyofthesecondworldwar@outlook.com. That's the email, and send them in, answer them at some point in the future when I get enough of them for a full episode. That's historyofthesecondworldwar@outlook.com. In the aftermath of the First World War, many of the empires that had been fixtures of the European order for centuries were dismantled. In Eastern Europe and the Balkans, both the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires had controlled much of the territory for as long as anyone could remember, and their downfall left a major power vacuum in the region. The small nations that would be created during the years after the end of the conflict represented the hopes and dreams of many nationalist groups that had been growing in power and influence over the previous decades. We've already discussed the fate of some of these countries before and during the Second World War on this podcast. Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were all among their number. And by 1940, they no longer were independent states. During 1940 and 1941, the war would also spill into another group of these countries, with Yugoslavia being the focus of our story in this series of podcasts. Yugoslavia had been created after the First World War and encompassed many of the southern territories of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, along with the area that had previously been known as Serbia. It encompassed areas that were populated by multiple different ethnic groups, including Serbs, Slovenes, Croats, and many other smaller groups. When the Second World War started in Europe with the German invasion of Poland, Yugoslavia found itself in an awkward position. It had good relations with France during the 1920s and 1930s. However, during the late 1930s, its economy had become entangled with that of Germany. There were multiple raw materials that Yugoslavia had access to that Germany greatly desired, and with the German rearmament programs, they were able to trade manufactured goods, military hardware, and industrial tools for Yugoslavia's raw materials. Yugoslav leaders then wanted to remain neutral in the conflict once it started, but this was a difficult thing for many Eastern European countries to do. They could not hope to defend themselves from an external threat like Germany or the Soviet Union, and so their only hope was to try and tread some kind of middle ground if they wanted to stay out of the war. For Yugoslavia, that middle ground would prove to no longer be tenable during the spring of 1941. This would be caused not by Germany, but instead Italy, and its disastrous invasion of Greece in late 1940. Because after that invasion, and with their calls for German assistance, Germany demanded that they be allowed to move military forces through Yugoslavia on the way to Greece. When this access was denied, tensions began to mount, eventually resulting in the invasion and subjugation of Yugoslavia under a joint German and Italian occupation. During the interwar years, Yugoslavia and the other nations of Eastern Europe were not blind to the challenges that they would face if either Germany or the Soviet Union decided to become aggressive in Eastern Europe. There were discussions about forming some kind of Balkan or Eastern European defense alliance, but there were too many challenges in trying to make that happen. In the Balkans, there were some nations that were happy with the outcome of the First World War and the Paris Peace Conference, notably Greece, Romania, and Yugoslavia. But then there were others that were far less satisfied with the status quo at the time. Bulgaria would be on that list, having been a member of the Central Powers during the First World War and having lost territories to the other nations who had joined the Allies during that war. This dissatisfaction would be the downfall of the attempts to form a Balkan defensive pact, even though it appeared that progress was being made in 1929 and 1930. This included the First Balkan Conference, which was held in Athens in October 1930, with the goal of drafting a guiding document for a Balkan pact. There were many dreams, the creation of a Balkan Commission to address grievances between states, discussions of military and economic cooperation, and all the other things that may have helped the vulnerable nations against outside interference. But these conversations would all come to naught, with Bulgaria deciding to not sign any documents because of a lack of support among many internal groups in Bulgaria to the existing territorial situation. The biggest sticking point were the territories of Macedonia that had been lost after the First World War. Even the leaders of Yugoslavia were somewhat hesitant about the Balkan Pact, though, out of fear that signing any kind of agreement would only further antagonize Italy. This is because some of the territories that Yugoslavia had been awarded on the Adriatic back in the early 1920s had been areas that Italy had essentially entered the First World War to get control of. That they had not been given to Italy was seen as a major national setback. This would sour relations with Italy and Yugoslavia and would be one of the major reasons that Italy would instigate a war in the Balkans in 1940. Bulgaria would also eventually join them, announcing that they were joining the Axis powers in March 1941. While the Balkan countries were working together to build a diplomatic future that never happened, Yugoslavia was also working hard on industrialization programs to bring its economy into the modern world. In these efforts, Germany was far and away the most important trading partner from which Yugoslavia could count on demand for its raw materials and the ability to exchange those materials for foreign investments and industrial goods. For example, German groups would make major investments into the oil company that would eventually become known as Yugopetrol, which would see a major expansion in the last years before the war. In those same years, around 2/3 of all vehicles and tools that Yugoslavia imported came from Germany. During the peacetime years, this was critical for the Yugoslav economy, as it was one of the few nations where trade could easily happen and happen efficiently because of the closed nature of many economies during the 1930s after the Great Depression. When the war started and suddenly everything was more dangerous and risky, well, those relations kept going because Germany was right there, sharing a border with Yugoslavia. During the summer of 1939, major agreements had been signed between the two governments, with the Yugoslavs committing to provide additional raw materials to the Germans in exchange for military equipment and weapons. Most important items on the list for export to Germany were copper and lead, but for the Yugoslav army, the equipment was just as valuable because many of the items could not be produced domestically. Just like everybody else at this time, the Yugoslav army was expanding, and so those weapons were crucial to Yugoslav defense plans. But with Germany starting a war, there was a hesitancy by the German government to begin exporting a bunch of equipment that they themselves needed for the planned invasion of Poland and then whatever happened after. This caused serious delays in the delivery of those goods. But neither side was willing to turn away from these agreements because they were pretty important to both sides. And instead, an additional agreement would be signed in September 1939, with additional raw material exports, particularly zinc, copper, and lead, and also tin being added to the list, which the German rearmament programs had an almost insatiable appetite for. In exchange, the Germans promised to provide 100 Messerschmitt fighters, anti-aircraft guns, and anti-tank guns. What's interesting to note, and shows how quickly the situation in the Balkans would evolve in the early months of 1941, is that most of the military equipment that the Germans agreed to send would actually be delivered in the second half of 1940. The exact numbers are a bit fuzzy, but in all the agreements that were signed, the Germans agreed to send about 114 million Reichsmarks worth of military hardware to Yugoslavia, and by January 1941, 80 million Reichsmarks, or about 70%, had already been delivered. This equipment would then be used by the Yugoslavs' forces who attempted to defend themselves against the German invasion in April 1941. What's pretty clear is that the Germans did not plan to invade Yugoslavia. In fact, they really didn't want to for a very long time, right up until right before the invasion happened. While Germany and Yugoslavia had built up strong economic ties, Germany was not the only belligerent with interest in the economy and military of Yugoslavia, and during the first year of the war, the situation in the Balkans would be discussed constantly by the leaders in London and Paris. During the 1920s, the French had tried to set up a system of alliance and guarantees in Eastern Europe to act as a counterweight against possible future German aggression. And while this had, for the most part, failed completely, it did show that the French valued relations with those nations in Eastern Europe, even if they viewed those relationships in a very selfish way. They really just wanted to distract some German divisions if the Germans started to attack. Of course, most of those relations, most of those alliances had not been formed, and those that had, with Czechoslovakia or Poland, had already been eclipsed by the war. And so in 1940 and 1939, there were still discussions, but the British and French were kind of working from an outsider perspective. Looking into one of those cabinet discussions, the British War Cabinet would meet on September 20th, 1939, which was at a point where the situation in Poland was such that it was clear what the outcome would be. And at the meeting, they discussed the British and French policies for the Balkans, and they would describe their goals like this, quote, to hold and wear out enemy strength away from the Western theater of war, to prevent Germany from obtaining control of economic resources in the Balkans, to provide strategic cover for Franco-British interests in the Near East, and in particular to close the Mediterranean to enemy ships coming from the Black Sea, to prepare a theater of operations with a view of ultimate offensive operations, to furnish visible evidence of the desire to stand by the Franco-British guarantee to Romania and Greece, end quote. What this shows is that during this period of the war, in this case September 1939, the French and the British had a lot of goals, or a lot of aspirations, and the belief in themselves that they could make something happen in the Balkans. However, most of these scenarios and most of these goals were invalidated by the Italian entry into the war. For Yugoslavia, they barely played into any of these scenarios due to their position close to Germany, with the British leaders hoping that they could maybe assist Greece if needed, but nothing further from the Eastern Mediterranean. The British would try and exert economic influence on Yugoslavia, though, to try and prevent them from supplying Germany with more resources. They did this partially by simply buying up as many of those resources as possible, essentially trying to buy their way into enhancing the economic blockade of Germany. But after the fall of France, this strategy was also no longer possible, and suddenly Yugoslavia was cut off from all trade from the outside world due to the entry of Italy into the war. The second half of 1940 would be the period when Yugoslavia would begin to lose its freedom of action, being sandwiched between Germany, Italy, and neutral or hostile nations to the east. With the British and French no longer of assistance, there was another possibility that the Yugoslav leaders had been working to create throughout 1940, and this was from the Soviet Union. Soviet and before them Russian leaders had long held interests in the Balkans, and they had, after all, entered into the First World War specifically due to promises made to Serbia. During the spring and summer of 1940, progress was made in creating relations between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, two nations who, until March 1940, had no official relations at all. For the Yugoslav leaders, the Soviets seemed to be a way to provide some balance against the overwhelming reliance of the Yugoslav military on Germany and importing equipment from Germany. For the Soviets, establishing relations with Yugoslavia and expanding its military capabilities would give them an ally in the Balkans to try and counterbalance against the slide of many other Balkan states towards Germany. This would culminate in negotiations in late November 1940, during which the Soviet representatives promised almost anything that the Yugoslav military needed in exchange for money and some materials. The good news with this relationship is that the Soviets were far less resource constrained than the Germans, and so the Yugoslavs could just purchase the weapons that they needed. And this was seen as a major win for the Yugoslav government and military, and it would have allowed them to take advantage of the rapidly expanding manufacturing capacity of the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, very little would actually be delivered before the German invasion. Another problem for Yugoslavia was that they were not the only nation who was evolving their foreign relations during the second half of 1940. All of the countries in the region suddenly became hot commodities among the various interested powers, with Germany, Italy, Britain, and the Soviet Union all trying to influence events. Romania was seen as a critical piece as well, a country that had been a major beneficiary of the post-World War I treaties. The year 1940 would see many of its territories simply stripped away, with the Soviets invading the territories of Bessarabia and Bukovina in June 1940, and then parts of Dobruja being peeled away by Bulgaria with strong German support. Then in August 1940, one-third of Transylvania was signed away to Hungary, again due to strong German pressure. Eventually, this string of territorial losses would prompt the replacement of the Romanian government, and General Ion Antonescu would come to power. Antonescu was in favor of joining the war on Germany's side, and therefore in October 1940, the first German military mission entered Romania in October, soon followed by Army and Luftwaffe units that would help to protect the incredibly valuable oil fields from possible Soviet attack. In Romania, along with many other places in Eastern Europe, joining the war with Germany was prompted most of the time by fear of Soviet attacks, and in fact, Antonescu would frequently request a larger German military presence and greater military strength from Germany, specifically to counteract the possibility of a Soviet invasion. Another important player in the story of Yugoslavia would be the nation of Bulgaria. Bulgaria had been the enemy of several other countries during the Second Balkan War, which had immediately preceded the First World War, and then it had joined the Central Powers during the Great War. The peace agreements that were signed during the Paris Peace Conference cost Bulgaria greatly, with several pieces of territory being ceded to other surrounding countries. This made Bulgaria receptive to the ideas of territorial revisionism, which was at the heart of both the German and Italian war efforts. However, this did not prevent the Bulgarians, led by King Boris, from declaring their neutrality when the Germans invaded Poland in 1939. By the autumn of 1940, though, the situation had changed decisively. And with Germany devoting more attention to the Balkans, they would also put more pressure on Bulgaria to openly join in the war. There was still a lot of hesitancy from the Bulgarians, due primarily to their concerns that their military and economy were simply not ready for war. And so they made their entrance into the war dependent on the arrival of German arms and equipment. They would then allow German forces to move through Bulgaria, and eventually stage on their borders for further operations. This was critical to the course of the campaign in Yugoslavia because it allowed the Germans to attack from multiple different directions, with one of the primary offensive efforts being staged from within Bulgaria. The treaty to allow this movement was signed on March 1, 1941, with one of the main provisions being that it should be kept secret as long as possible to prevent any kind of reaction from Yugoslavia or Greece to the south. It would be the beginning of a long war for the Bulgarians, which would see them join not just in the invasion of other Balkan nations, but also into the Soviet Union in 1941. It would not go well once they got into the Soviet Union. Essentially, the fall of France required an entire restructuring of how the nations in the Balkans viewed the war, but the direct cause of the eventual invasion of Yugoslavia would be the actions of the Italians. After the German military had completed their romp through France, resulting in the eventual signing of the armistice, Mussolini began to look beyond the borders of Italy for somewhere that the Italian forces could attack and gain territory. The Balkans was an obvious area, particularly due to the existing Italian desires for territorial expansion along the Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean. Their target would be Greece, using their new bases in Albania, which they had captured several months earlier. The Germans, who had been informed of the Italian intentions, warned their ally not to execute the invasion of Greece, but Mussolini and the Italian military leaders would ignore these words of caution. The attack would be a failure, as will be discussed in later episodes of the podcast here in a few weeks. But importantly for Yugoslavia, it resulted in requests from the Italians that the Italian military traffic be allowed to transit through Yugoslavia on its way to Albania and then to Greece. As a neutral nation, this is not something that Yugoslavia could allow, and the Italians were informed that this was not possible as it was the official position of the government to stay neutral in the Greco-Italian War. The Italian response was not to give up, but instead to ask the Germans for help, with both Yugoslavia and then eventually with Greece. The German foreign minister, Ribbentrop, would speak with the Yugoslav leaders and try to convince them to give in to the Italian demands. When this message was not met with acceptance, the first thing that happened was the ongoing deliveries of military equipment were halted while further discussions could take place. Instead of simply insisting that they give in to the Italians, the demands were escalated so that the demands were changed to the Yugoslav government joining the tripartite pact, which would bring them into the war on the side of Germany. These demands would become more important when a few weeks later, and near the end of 1940, the decision was made in Berlin to send military assistance to the Italians in Greece. The best way to move that military assistance down through the Balkans would be to move them through Yugoslavia, and so they really needed that treaty signed. It was theoretically possible that the required German forces could have moved through Bulgaria, but the Bulgarian infrastructure would have made this very difficult, and supporting the advance into Greece even more of a challenge. To make matters worse, when word arrived in Moscow that Bulgaria might soon allow German forces into the country, Stalin sent a message to both Bulgaria and Germany that Bulgaria was considered to be in the Soviet sphere of influence and that they should remove themselves immediately. This message also contained a clear threat of action against the Bulgarian territory on the Black Sea, which caused the Bulgarian leaders to hesitate in their commitment to allowing large German military formations to move through their borders, making discussions with the Yugoslavs even more important. After the initial demands had been made in December 1940, the Yugoslav leaders had mostly been playing for time, but that time would begin to run out in early 1941. From the period of roughly mid-February to mid-March 1941, there was a constant and somewhat frantic set of diplomatic activity happening in the Balkans. The Turkish-Bulgarian non-aggression pact would be signed on February 17th, taking Turkey out of the immediate picture and removing one of the major threats to Bulgaria. Yugoslav leaders would continue to try and find ways around signing the tripartite agreement, but the Germans were persistent and gave a constant stream of guarantees to try and reduce the anxiety of Yugoslav leaders. Most important would be that the Germans would never force the Yugoslav military to assist them in any campaign unless they joined voluntarily. Essentially, the Yugoslavs would not be forced into any military adventures. This included the conflict that was already occurring in Greece. However, this clause would be a secret clause and would not be announced or officially published, which is important to remember for the events that would follow in March and April. The Yugoslav leaders were quite rightly hesitant to trust any German promises because the German leaders were on like a 5-year run of not honoring many of their promises. But there was a growing feeling of inevitability among the Yugoslav leaders, and so on March 20th, 1941, the decision was made among the Crown Council to accept the German demands and to sign the tripartite treaty. This caused havoc among the Yugoslav government, with multiple ministers simply resigning. The treaty would still be signed, though, on March 25th. The deal that was signed was relatively favorable for Yugoslavia if it had been honored, with the provisions that Yugoslavia could stay out of military campaigns if it wanted, that it had official interest in gaining control of Thessaloniki on the Greek coast, and that there would be restrictions on moving German troops and war material through the country. It was about as good of an agreement as the Yugoslavs could have hoped for. But the response to the news of the signing inside of Yugoslavia was very mixed. Some parts of Yugoslavia supported the Germans, some parts strongly supported continued neutrality, but then there were others that were heavily anti-German. The strong points for anti-German feelings were in the Serbian areas, including the capital of Belgrade, which was important when, on the 27th of March, a group of Serbian military officers staged a coup. They were able to take advantage of the heavily anti-German sentiments of the population around the capital to take control of the government. The goal of the new government was to attempt to stay out of the war, to tread the delicate path of neutrality that they believed the previous government had needlessly abandoned to join the German cause. They did not, in any way, fully understand that those decisions had been made due to strong and clear German pressure, which any successor government would also have to contend with. The response back to Germany was immediate, and when Hitler was informed, he would sign Directive No. 25 the very same day, which was the general directives for attacks on Yugoslavia, which had been formulated during a series of meetings on the 27th of March, in the direct aftermath of the coup. With the distribution of Directive No. 25, the German military was committed to an invasion of Yugoslavia, which was to occur just a week later on April 6th. The days between would be a frantic race by the German military to plan an invasion that until the 27th they did not believe was even a possibility. That invasion will be the topic for next episode.